In the old days, say pre-1990s, capital was king or queen. You called the shots. Now capital is a burden. I estimate that globally there's roughly 10 to $20 trillion in excess capital that has no useful home, no place to go. It's just roaming the world, searching for a use. For those who possess that capital, it's a little bit of a nightmare. So it can kind of make up its own opportunities, or it can allow crazy financial opportunities to arise solely to put that money to work.
There is a world made up of numbers. A world where you have to be the smartest or the fastest. A world connected by radio waves and fiber optic cables. A world where you can make money if you think you know what the future holds. A world of fear and desire, where you can win or lose. I call this world Planet Finance. Wandering around Planet Finance, I arrive at a place where they really love risk. Here they speculate on the chance of a wildfire, flood, or other catastrophe happening.
You want to try going from there? Come on, boys, let's go.
This man lives off disasters.
I married while I was in college, and I started my family while I was doing my PhD. My first child, he cost the insurance company $500,000 being born prematurely. And so the person at the insurance company told me, your next child won't be covered.
Oh, so good.
Someone whispered to me and they said, hey, go to Wall Street. You know a lot of math. They'll give you health care just for solving one equation.
Okay.
So in the first interview, the person comes in, he said, John, does money motivate you? And he went on, a 10 or 15-minute speech that culminated almost, do you worship at the altar of money? Does money mean more to you than anything else on this planet? Et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, wow, this is a very long speech. And so I waited for him to finish, and I said, no.
Now, see?
Then why are you here? I said, oh, I just need health insurance, and I'll do anything that you ask me to do. That was my start. And that led directly and eventually to my getting a phone call from Lehman Brothers one day for catastrophe bonds. I said, oh, wow. I go, okay, so I have no experience in that. And he said, that's the great thing, nobody does.
On Planet Finance, there is a market for nearly everything, even for a future disaster. A disaster that hasn't happened yet. A disaster that might never happen. There are people who spend all their time calculating the minimum chance of such a disaster happening, and, above all, the extent of the damage.
What is a crisis or a catastrophe or a hurricane? What happens is it causes chaos. And chaos is the breakdown of typical systems. And it's this feeling of you normally walk around, you're like, I know the subway is going to come at this time. I know that I have to go to work at 9. I have to leave by 5 and to go to the grocery store. And then a crisis hits And none of that is known anymore. Suddenly, it's all in the world of unknown.
To show you how such a chaotic situation can give rise to a market, I will take you back to a dark autumn night in 2011. Hurricane Sandy reaches the shores of New York. A state of emergency is declared and all traffic comes to a standstill. The south part of Manhattan is flooded, and power goes out. The next morning, the extent of the damage becomes clear, and even Wall Street is forced to close trading for 2 days. A rarity. The last time that happened was after 9/11.
The aftermath is a process of how do you go from chaos back to understanding or back to some sort of stability. It's not going to be the same as it was before, but hopefully a little bit more stable than that moment of chaos.
The storm leaves New York with 43 dead and billions of dollars of damage. The flooded tunnels are the greatest disaster to ever happen to the city's public transportation system.
Be careful because the water has some grease in it, so it might be a little slippery.
So how do you make a business out of that? What is the business? Well, the business is being able to predict that risk and price it.
How can anyone make money out of a disaster? A disaster that only seems to leave losers in its wake.
The tunnel filled with water for about 2/3 of its length. We estimate there were about 60 million gallons of salt water entered the tunnel. I think it was about a week of solid pumping just to pump the water out of the tunnel. That was before we started doing any repairs or cleaning or anything like that. I don't think anybody knew what the intensity of it was going to be when it actually came. And, you know, we weren't really prepared for it, I guess.
Today, New York is prepared. To be able to pay for the damage when the next hurricane happens, a former banker has found the solution. She spent years on Wall Street and now works for the Transportation Authority of New York. For the uninsurable damage, she goes to Planet Finance for help.
We all hear about hurricanes in the Caribbean. We know about damage in Florida occasionally, and we never thought that it would come here, but it did. Of course, our system was devastated. The inside of our tunnels have a lot of electrical equipment that was all ruined. Our damages were like in about $800 million range, I think. We were only able to get about 500 million, give or take, in coverage, and the premium doubled, actually more than doubled. So we were concerned that we were not able to get enough coverage. That's when we started working on our first cat bond transaction.
Let's explain that one first. Cat bond is short for catastrophe bond. A bond is nothing more than a loan that has to be paid back before a specified date. I lend you a sum of money, you pay me interest, and at the end of the term, you pay me back the borrowed amount. But a cat bond goes further than that. If a disaster occurs before the end of the loan's term, the money lender loses the entire sum, which is then used to compensate for the damage and save New York.
It's exactly like insurance, right? Insurance collects your premium while everything's okay. It's supposed to pay you when you have pain and loss.
So now New York pays interest on a cat bond instead of an insurance premium. And if you want to buy a cat bond, you go to John So.
I described the deal, and I fairly quickly got to the size. It's like, oh, nothing, just 500 million, you know.
Years ago, John couldn't get health insurance when his wife was expecting a second baby. Now he owns a hedge fund specialized in cat bonds.
Even the hedge fund there is leaving 400 basis points on the table, right? That's why, it's like, because we're not.
Cat bonds that should cover the damage of future disasters.
The reasoning is that there are all these opportunities, and you just have to give examples like I gave, right? But as I say,
To get in on the game, you need at least 100 million euros.
hold on a second. This is $1.5 billion commercial mortgage that's backed by the collateral of the building itself, the complex, but the complex itself is not insured against earthquake or flood, even, or all these.
There are even cat bonds to cover the damage of solar storms and meteorite impacts.
So this is our main room. We're 31 people, and we invest in bonds. Now, bonds are usually very simple. These bonds are called catastrophe bonds, meaning earthquakes, hurricanes, floods. We lose money when they occur. So we're not profiting off of destruction. We're insuring destruction that is otherwise too large for traditional insurance companies to handle comfortably. So there's a lot of computation that's involved in this.
This server room is the heart of the company. The computers link the widest range of data sets together and continuously calculate the probability of a future disaster happening, plus the damage it might cause.
It's set up so that my older brother, who used to sit right over there, can actually see all the status lights from his desk. So it turns out running a server room is very complex because you have software to see if software is broken, but then you need software to look at that software to see if it's broken, and usually the whole chain doesn't work all the time. So the best indicator of failure is actually a red light. So you want to be able to stand up and see the red lights. Investors around the world are looking for something new to invest their money in, and then they find us. Once they find us and allow us to invest their money, then really the rest is relatively easy. Oh, hey, hello.
Right.
Are we on?
That 10 to 20 trillion dollars of capital roaming the world is urgently looking for returns.
Our clients are wonderful. They come from every continent, from every investor class in the world. So it's everything from giant national pension funds, corporate pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, banks, endowments, charities, and wealthy individuals.
What would happen if the normal traditional bonds witness higher yields? How would it affect the cat bonds?
You know, our market is.
If the interest rates on other bonds go up, as they do today, the interest rates on cat bonds automatically go up as well, so the returns remain high.
You know, in a sense, catastrophe bonds are the only thing left over to absorb that extra risk. The demand for cyber risk coverage is going to explode over the next year.
John So's clients invest millions in his hedge fund, and throughout the term of the cat bond, they receive an attractive interest rate in return. But first, the conditions under which they can lose their money are precisely defined. There are so-called triggers for that. What the minimum damage should be after a wildfire, or what the minimum water level should be during a flood.
The trigger was created specifically for our area. Basically, the modeling firm did the analysis where potential storms can come from, and they analyzed about 100 years of data. They model 100,000 storms based on all this data available historically. And basically, they're continuously measuring water levels. The triggers are, if in area A, the trigger level, the water hits 7.75 feet, or in area B, it hits 12.75 feet above NAV 88, then transaction triggers. Another condition for the transaction to trigger is that there's got to be a named storm.
Every new hurricane season, the first tropical storm gets a name starting with the letter A until the end of the alphabet is reached. Anna, Bill, Claudette, Danny. Many named storms have swept across New York since, but the water never reached as high as it did during Sandy.
It actually never triggered. So far, investors didn't lose any money on us. We hope it is going to happen at some point. I'm joking. But yeah, so far so good. So far it hasn't triggered. We didn't have another Sandy.
So this cat bond is not only a solution for New York, but Planet Finance is happy as well. A typical win-win situation.
A catastrophe bond is brilliant because it's so simple. There was no complexity for the investors. You know, when you set a high watermark there, and you tell very clearly to the organization, if the water comes to 8 feet, not 8.5 feet, then we have no insurance. The engineers know how high to make the sandbags, to design all the flood barriers for all the entrances too.
So one of the mitigation measures that we put into place after Sandy was these floodgates right here. These are steel hinged floodgates. Each of these gates weighs approximately more than 40,000 pounds, so approximately 20,000 kilograms. This floodgate seemed to be the best combination of cost, strength. As long as we maintain them and replace the gaskets, these should last for 7,500 years.
John's job is to make sure that even if there is a big storm, there is no damage to his tunnel, our tunnel, I should say, right? So my job is to make sure that if there is damage, we have money to fix it, right? Investors who invest in cat bonds, they're just used to investing in this kind of risk. That's what they do. And to be honest, because it's such a risky asset, right? They enjoy much higher interest rates that are currently available on other assets. You know, they will invest a little bit in MTA cat bond and then invest a little bit in the earthquake in Mexico cat bond and a little bit in Japanese typhoon cat bond. And this is how they diversify their portfolio so things don't hit all at once and they don't lose everything. But
So there is a market for disasters all around the world, each with its own risk, and therefore its own price.
Managing catastrophe risk is very, very particular. And this was originally what drove my perception of the opportunity here. The opportunity, not just for profit, but to actually create a whole nother industry that never existed before. It was driven by the fact that traditional finance actually is very uncomfortable dealing with catastrophe risk and effectively sweeps it under the rug, right? They want to think about the opposite, which is, the winning lottery ticket, hitting it big, big upside. Who wants to think about downside? So the very first task I set myself to, even before I went to Lehman Brothers to manage a catastrophe trading group, was to actually redevelop all the mathematics outside of the bell curve, right?
So there it is, the bell curve. A graph in the shape of a church bell. Traditional banks and insurance companies use the bell curve to calculate their risk. In the middle, you see what is most likely to happen. For instance, the chance of people paying off their mortgage. The sides of the curve show you the chance of what is less likely to happen, like mortgages that aren't paid off due to unemployment or illness. The business model of Planet Finance is built on the most likely risks, not on the so-called tail risk. That's where it becomes much harder to make precise predictions. Because what are the chances of an airplane flying into the World Trade Center, or of a tsunami crashing straight into a nuclear power plant? These are the unexpected events the traditional part of planet finance isn't prepared for. But John So lives off these fickle chances.
The reason why they're stuck on that framework is because they don't have anything else. And it terrifies them, because if you can't rely on that, there is actually no academic framework for dealing with systemic catastrophe risks. Because if you don't have that framework, then you can only deal with emotion or relying on old-fashioned techniques that are known not to work. And you need to break with that if you're going to survive in the catastrophe bond arena.
So John So's algorithms can be used to calculate the chance of a disaster happening. But to me, human behavior seems much harder to capture in an algorithm.
Because individuals are too wild and wet and non-uniform to be conquered with simple mathematics.
To show you how those planet finance algorithms affect planet Earth, I travel to the village of Bonny Doon. A close-knit community on the American West Coast. A place where the threat of wildfires looms every long, dry summer.
Here's Josh.
Hey! Hey, I hear you. Are you gonna be there for a few minutes?
All right, I'll be around.
The community has a village elder who lives off the wood from the forest.
Johnny, did you see there's 3 deer in the orchard?
His wife, who grows flowers for weddings and celebrations.
Those darn deer might go up over the road.
We have to shoosh some deer out of the garden. Okay.
And this man, who makes his living drilling water wells.
I think we're set. Okay. Oh, you want to get fuel? You already got it.
And a teacher who gives lessons to convicts. When one fateful August night a wildfire came straight at them, they decided to fight it themselves. It was the night that marked the beginning of the Santa Cruz lightning complex fires, which started with as many as 11,000 bolts of lightning.
In all the 50 years or more that we've been here, we have never seen so much lightning, and we thought, what is going on? But we still, the fire hadn't really become a reality.
Well, it wasn't a reality. It hadn't
started yet.
And there happens to be some lightning, chain lightning, by the Monterey Bay. Gotta check this out.
We looked out our bedroom window, and we had never seen anything like it.
Well, it was lighting up the sky everywhere. It wasn't even in one spot.
There's the wall of clouds coming towards us. Something's coming. Something big. Something's going. Thunderclouds. It's huge. Huge.
I mean, it was behind us, it was up north of us, it was everywhere. There were big lightning bolts going off all over the place. And that's why there were 9 different fires started, you know. And the thunderclaps were loud. They weren't just, you know, all way off in the distance. They were right on top
around
of
us.
The fire department, well, we didn't ever see them, to be truthful, because they were all going to these different fire locations. I took Nancy, our daughter, and all the kids, and everyone up here evacuated. And then fire was hitting. It was hitting the upper part of Bonny Doon. It was coming up that Swanton area and starting down this way.
Every human being is constantly making his own personal assessments, how to deal with the risks of life.
John was up on the mountain by himself. His son had left, his daughter had left. Everybody was gone, except for John. All the neighbors left. John was the only one who stayed. There was one night when John was the only one up there. He's also kind of this patriarch of our community and a really well-respected elder, I would call him. And so I felt the need that I needed to go up just to help John if help was needed.
And when disaster suddenly strikes, you can freeze, flee, or fight.
Most of us, even though we're hermits, just kind of were like, okay, the government's gonna handle it, let's get out of the way. And then when John Lingaman decided to stay, you know, he let us all know that nobody was here. You know, it's kind of like that age-old story, like no one's coming to save you. Ooh, cop. Don't know what he's doing here. Maybe we're all in trouble. But we kept getting refused by the police. So we ended up sneaking up here. I'm so curious about that. Sheriff, we rarely get cops up here just because, you know, why patrol? We're not super interesting.
Yeah, to start, we'll be revisiting some notable wildfires.
Many miles away, John So and his team are trying to calculate the possible damage of the wildfires to see if any triggers could be activated.
The Tubbs fire from 2017, Camp Fire from 2018, Woolsey from 2018, and the Santa Cruz Landing Fire from 2020.
So then let me see here. Where are the property counts there? The actual property counts are there in line 6, right?
You obviously see in green the fire perimeter for the Santa Cruz fire, the CZU fire.
What's in green? That's the green is it's not forest, it's actually the fire perimeter?
That's the fire perimeter, which I'm gonna turn on and off, toggle on and off.
Okay.
And
could you create a different color for that?
Yeah.
Make it red?
Yeah. What you see is a bunch of yellow dots, and each of those dots represents properties in and around, in this case, this Santa Cruz County.
We know what resources are. At the very beginning of that event, we tested a new satellite imagery processing technique to try to predict what the losses of that fire would be. But would you say the burn ratio in those areas, total number of structures versus, you know...
It will be quite high.
It will be high.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's what would be interesting to find out, because now you're basically coming up with a resource kind of dependent view on what the burn ratio is going to be, which I like. Wildfires are very common, and they are relatively straightforward events. You have ignition, you have burn, and then you have damage. So where most people actually think that the greatest uncertainty lies is in the damage itself, right? If you burn a certain area, then how many of the homes are destroyed? And there is some uncertainty in there, but there's surprising patterns in that.
Maybe those patterns can be recognized in the data, but I wonder what good those calculations are to you when the fire is coming your way.
No one knew how bad it would get. All night long, I would go up to the top of our property, and during the night, I kept hearing these explosions that I thought were the propane tanks. I mean, it was a boom, you know. Ash was falling on me, but it was still a tiny breeze on the back of my neck. The little breeze was actually blowing the fire slightly away from us. In the morning, it came over the ridge, and then I could see trees flaring up. I was walking around, and I guess partially because my daughter was emotionally, I guess she was tweeting and calling people telling them to get me out of here.
It was a very surreal experience. Rodents, mice and rats literally like running through your legs, just fleeing the fire. And then the butterflies. A lot of monarch butterflies were just landing on me in the woods. And they didn't seem, I mean, how can you read a butterfly's personality? But they didn't seem panicked. You know, the way a butterfly is just so light in the way they live, it seems like. And so they're just kind of cruising along, and they would land and then they would move on. But there was a lot more than I have ever seen in the woods. And obviously they were just moving away from the danger.
They don't have necessarily decent roads coming in, going out. CAL FIRE won't be able to reach there.
So the burn ratio is going to be 60%.
Sure, yeah.
The fire was finally starting to come around and approach us.
Anybody that knows how to go towards the campfire?
No, I don't know. I think I realized probably on the second day of fighting the fire that we were going to control it as long as the weather didn't change. The information was so poor from social media.
On their iPhones, they were seeing pictures of that very aggressive fire.
And so from social media, there was these satellite images that showed what they said were hot spots of where it was burning and where it wasn't. So it was kind of an overlay of the topography of the land, and it just had a bunch of dots. The red dots where it was really hot, orange wasn't as hot, yellow maybe it had already burned, and then green was okay. And when you looked at it, it showed red dots all over our house and all over our neighborhood. People were hyper-focused on this image, and they're just like, it's burning right here. And then we would get texts from them, from people in town saying, it's burning on Back Ranch Road. You need to go check it out. You need to get out. That's your only way out. And we go out to Back Ranch Road, and there was no fire. And we'd say, there's no way it's burning on Back Ranch Road. We can see the fire. It's right here, you know? And then we would tell them, and then, no, it's burning on Warren Drive. You need to go get out. And then we'd go look and be like, no, it's not burning there either. And it wasn't until, I think, probably 3 or 4 days in, we realized that the satellite image was transposed improperly. It needed to shift east by about a mile or so.
The fire went around and came up the back side, and all of a sudden we got a desperate hollering. And there was a draw there. It had come up and it caught one of its outbuildings on fire. By the time I got up there, it had taken off. It was really burning. We weren't going to stop it. It literally sounded like some jet plane preparing to take off. And that's when I decided, you know, this is ridiculous. Let's get the bulldozers, and we pushed this fire break through.
And with those bulldozers, the Bonny Doon residents create a wall, a fire break between themselves and the approaching flames.
It almost looks like that upper left lobe.
Yeah,
Look, go to the left there. Yeah, that lobe right there. That looks like they were the ones that actually successfully built a perimeter.
So I'm gonna zoom in on that and actually see if I can see
the human behavior is a fundamental part of the modeling. It's actually already taking into account that there's millions of sometimes very stubborn and independent, especially here in the U.S., homeowners who are defying orders to leave and evacuate, running around, you know, putting up boards over their windows and defending their homes. If it weren't for that behavior, then the losses would easily be double or triple what we're observing. So it's actually, in a sense, priced in, this human behavior.
Right. So John So has already factored in this behaviour of large groups of people. But what about the behaviour of a single individual? Because whether our village elder can be insured against wildfires is decided today by algorithms. In New York, a fintech startup is confident that it can calculate the risk of a wildfire down to the smallest detail, and therefore determine whether something is insurable or not.
And the first version of our model didn't really take into account the randomness of lightning, so it didn't really consider lightning as a major variable. So when
the reason we exist is because the old way of doing things isn't really working anymore. The traditional way of understanding risk is, let's look at this spot on the map, this zip code, and we look and say, okay, over the last 500 years, this has burned 5 times. So it has a 1 in 100 chance of burning. And then you price it accordingly. The problem is, it's right there in the word, climate change.
You can see it right here. -4 is extreme drought, right? -3 is just...
So you can't really use the last 500 years and expect to be able to predict the next 10 years off of that. You have to do a much more bottom-up physical model using machine learning, looking at the reality of that place now. This is what the trees look like. This is what the weather looks like. This is where the fire breaks are. This is how close the closest fire engines are. And all that's being done by the model, the AI model. So it's, to give you an idea, the traditional way of doing it, they might run 100,000 simulations to get to that 1 in 100 number. They might say, run 100,000 different simulations and say, okay, I think that this has a 1 in 100 chance of burning. Our machine learning models, our models, they're running 682 billion simulations.
To build a well-functioning AI model out of 682 billion simulations, you need all kinds of things.
I'm losing money. I don't know how to model this anymore. The models aren't working. I'm going to leave. I'm not going to do this anymore.
First of all, you need investors' money.
Where else can you go with this?
But also brains, with a background on Wall Street.
And I started my career at Goldman Sachs, and I'm a doctor as well.
A climate scientist, a mathematician.
A probability that the fire will spread to a grid in California.
And the founders who zealously promote their AI model.
There is significant alpha that we could find in the industry, as we've seen, as they all pull back because they say, all right, we have no idea what the future is going to look like. There's a far more measured and data-driven approach that we could really take towards it. A lot of the traditional finances, so places like pension funds and hedge funds and family offices looked over and said, well, here's this whole world that's writing insurance policies. It's not focused at all on the stock market or in commodities or something like that. They're just focused on whether or not a hurricane happens, an earthquake happens, or wildfire happens. And why that's so valuable is because it's a non-correlated asset. And what I mean by that is the stock market can be doing whatever it is today, that's almost completely unrelated to whether or not the wind is blowing in Florida and there's a hurricane happening. And one of the best things you can have as an investor is something that's non-correlated, because even if you think you're diversified in your portfolio, but it's all in the stock market, well, if the stock market blows up tomorrow, then everything's gonna go down.
So the appeal of a cat bond is that it's a completely different type of risk. Even if Wall Street crashes tomorrow, the cat bond will still bear high interest rates.
We're headed out to Last Chance Road to get people water. We work on water wells and repairing water wells. Virtually every water well out here melted. Fire came through there very fast and very hot. Very different than the fire that we dealt with at our home. Sorry for the dirty windshield. It's only going to get dirtier today. It used to be you couldn't see any of this. This was all trees. That was a house there. There was a house right here. That one survived. One gentleman died out here. He was an elderly guy who went back in to get stuff, from what I heard, and he didn't make it out. He tried to hike out through the state park, and he didn't make it. They found him. Some of the neighbors found him.
After the disaster, there is nothing of value left. But when lightning strikes a bone-dry forest, or when a hurricane is on its way to the coast, and the extent of the insured damage isn't clear yet, that's when John So swings into action.
Whether it's a hurricane, wildfires, or an earthquake that just happens in the middle of the night, I get a phone call and I'm woken up. We have software and tools in which we bring up our portfolio and immediately assess the impact to the portfolio from the event.
So if I zoom in...
If it looks like a trigger is activated, and as an investor you could lose all your money, then you naturally want to get rid of your cat bond as soon as possible by putting it up for sale. That's when interesting opportunities arise.
If you're not able to estimate the losses of a live event like this, then you have to question your ability to estimate the risks, hypothetical risks to this bond and pricing it. So it's a little bit like a Formula One race.
Worldwide, very few players have the knowledge, computing power, and reaction speed necessary to play the game at this level.
Just before the fire, and then as soon as possible. I wonder whether that would be it.
A typical catastrophe bond portfolio will have roughly 200 positions in it.
What do you mean by it?
We'll have 200 different catastrophe bonds in it.
These databases available.
And so in a major event, roughly 80 to those are potentially exposed to the event. That narrows it down from 200 to 80. And then we are immediately estimating what the intensity of the event is going to be, and therefore what the financial losses will be. And then from that next cut, the 80 bonds that are at risk suddenly narrows down to 10. So that final list of bonds that are potentially at risk, the seller really just wants to sell.
A lot of media attention. We saw a lot of
like a hot potato no one wants to burn their fingers on, these cat bonds are now being resold for less and less money.
The market maker will call us and say, I've got an offer on 5 million of this bond at 60 cents on the dollar. So normally if the bond was not in trouble, it would trade at full value, 100 cents on the dollar. But it's offered at 60 cents on the dollar.
So if John So thinks he is better informed than the rest of the market, and he is sure that the trigger won't be activated and he won't lose millions, then he can seize his opportunity and buy a cat bond for a bargain price.
It's a tricky business because roughly every other year you have a catastrophe bond that loses money. And I've been doing this for over 20 years, so we've lost a lot of money on those cumulatively. We've made more than we've lost on that, but we've had significant loss experiences for sure.
So if a cat bond is really triggered, you lose a lot of money as an investor. Therefore, John has to constantly test the most recent climate projections against his own data and calculate the extent of the potential damage of those projections.
So here are the different end-of-century temperature projections. So obviously the 8.5 scenario is the highest.
Okay, so 2 degrees by 2050, 45, 40, et cetera.
And we tweaked the historical storms and ran it through their model. And on average, that increases by 1.34. So 34% you were. Yeah.
So it's a 0.3, no, it's a 3.5%.
3.4 and what I
Okay,
did.
3.4% increase in damage, right?
In damage.
And what'd you do?
Round up.
Oh, that's annualized.
And
that's
then you
why.
annualize it from today or from 2020.
Oh, okay.
The world is getting riskier, for sure. So that is driving growth in our marketplace. By our estimation, the world needs roughly 500 billion of catastrophe bond finance. Largely, it's for the time being a US-centered market, but the potential worldwide is immense. You know, whether it's flooding in Germany, flooding in Asia, particularly in China, you can calculate what the exposure is because in the end it's physical. So really you need effectively Google Earth and to look at all the property around the world and understand its vulnerability to earthquakes, hurricanes, and floods, and you can do the calculation.
Right. But what is the bottom line for the people of Bonny Doon?
For a lot of people up here, it was a huge surprise to them that the firemen didn't come. I think it really is a numbers game on people and then the amount of wealth within an entire community. So, you know, we might have some affluent community members, but it's not the Silicon Valley, or, you know, it's not all affluent community, so it's not worth it for them. I think it must be how close it is to a city that, you know, that they care about. For most of my community, it was the first time that they realized that they were not significant, and that they were deemed easily disposable.
Not significant. Disposable. The fire department wasn't willing or able to save many of the houses. So, cat bonds? At Bonny Doon, no one noticed their existence. They only work for you if you own insurable property.
This is Bonny Doon?
Yes, yes, June.
That's Chance Road.
Last chance. Last chance. Yes, this still shows us like a extremely high risk. We see that historically this place has burned in the past. So actually our model shows that this Bonny Doon location is like a 1.18% chance of burning. So that's actually within 95th percentile in terms of the risk. Yeah, so 95% of the California has lower risk than this particular location. The distance to wildland and urban interface is too close. And then the Palmer drought severity index is too low. And those are the reasons behind we think this location is actually too dangerous for us to insure.
So this is my little bunker. I've got 4 compressed air bottles there that are full of air. I'm never gonna, if I stay in here, I could stay in here hours with those tanks with no outside air. But my house would be burnt down, and I've got to come out of this as soon as that big wave burns over. I've got to be out there putting out the fires. But anyway, this is just there's a little insurance policy is what it is. You know, I doubt 90% of the time I'm never going to use this, but if that 5% of the time I need it, it could save my life. So that's why I got the compressed air tanks and the water, and it also gives our loved ones the assurance or the feeling that, oh yeah, Grandpa's got it together. He'll get in his little pizza oven and sit there and eat pizza, you know? So, and I've got hoses and I've got a little can of gas there, so I'm ready.
The people of Bonny Doon insure their own lives and rebuild them if they need to. Because if you live in Bonny Doon, or by the Maas River, or in Pakistan, you'd better build your own bunker or levee. If there's anything I've learned, is that it is hard to calculate the risk of a war, a pandemic, or climate change. Yet on Planet Finance, even this kind of risk is a good business model, because the capital that's roaming the world is always looking for a way, creating new arenas for profit. You could call it perverse, but for a few years now, the demand for cat bonds actually exceeds the expected catastrophes.